And also just a reminder that you will submit your Pechakucha assignment on November 13th, that's the Tuesday, by 11:55 p.m. in the Moodle Dropbox at the bottom of the page. So Donna Haraway writes that vision is always a question of the power to see, and perhaps this violence is implicit in our visualizing practices. So thinking about this quote and the tensions in mind, this week we'll be thinking together about the act of seeing and of taking a photo as something much more complex than we may assume. We'll be highlighting and discussing the colonial past-present histories in acts of photography and education, and perhaps open space for critical and creative ways of thinking with a camera in early childhood spaces. So following Indigenous and social geography scholar Sarah Hunt, she asks us, how can we avoid being agents of assimilation when it comes to Indigenous knowledge, people, and communities? And thinking with this question, how then might we pay attention to the technologies of developmental psychology and early childhood spaces as sites of knowledge production, and find ways in engaging in these spaces that are accountable to Indigenous rights and knowledges. So I'll quote Sarah Hunt in her article when she writes that one starting place might be accepting the partiality of knowledge. Its relational, alive, emergent nature means that as we come to know something, as we attempt to fix its meaning, we are always at the risk of just missing something, end quote. So this partiality that she's speaking of, this unknowability, is central to when we're thinking about children and photography. If we are able to challenge our appropriative and colonizing mentalities, then knowledge must be conceived as never fully known or capturable. And this must also then be enacted in our representational practices, or how we make our practices and knowledges visible. So in this way, your Pechakucha assignment is not intended to be a whole representation of your topic, but rather it's an emergent and partial tracing of how you are making meaning with this topic in the midst of its tensions. So we'll be experimenting with the languages of photography in this assignment to make something visible. So to think of photos not as static or passive, but rather that photography has a language and tells particular stories. So something that I've been thinking with is how our methods and the technologies that we use to think create worlds, as I mentioned before. So in this week's article, Sylvia writes that in taking a photo, we're choosing to look at something and illuminate it, and thus, like other methods of research, we're taking a particular position and representing it, however partially. So like the developmental technologies of research situated within developmental frameworks, we are also implicated in seeking and producing the realities that we're looking for. So in taking photos, we're never able to wholly represent something. Our image is always partial, as the world in movement doesn't stand still for us as we take a photo. So there's always a movement and something left out. And as we deconstruct technologies of developmental psychology, it's important to consider and acknowledge that in rethinking and responding with other ways of doing research and pedagogy, perhaps through course assignments or through pedagogical narration in our work with children, photography, we're always implicated in the messiness of our ways of seeing, our practices, their effects and consequences. So thinking with the article this week, we can see that the idea that a moment can be captured and represent a truth is very tensioned. So Sylvia writes that photography has been used to explore the otherness of certain groups of people, to classify body types of criminals, document race types, categorize pathology and deviance in human subjects, and has been used for regulation, categorization, and surveillance. So the language of photography itself is also quite oppressive, even violent, as we often use words like capture, expose, take, point, shoot in the practices of photography. So Sylvia also writes that photography has a particular voyeuristic gaze, a patriarchal lens that attempts to objectify and subjugate. It often emphasizes Eurocentric ways of looking and renders uncomplicated and static representations of what are really complex phenomena. So there's a separation and inherent superiority of the looker over the looked at in photography. So as we've been discussing in this course, in the 21st century, it's now widely discussed among scholars in the social sciences and humanities that research and education has a troubling past-present history that's rooted in colonial notions of discovery, conquest, exploitation, distribution, and appropriation. And beginning in the 15th century, during economic expansion of Western Europe, social research historically has been a significant tool in settler colonization and the colonization of indigenous land and bodies in what is now known as North America. So it's been used as a tool in the scientific acquisition of truth through the classification of phenomena, and as such is simultaneously encoded in colonial discourses, which, as Stanley Hall has argued, imply hidden rules about people and what counts as human. So early studies which examined the skull sizes of indigenous peoples to predict brain capacity, to more recent ventures identifying psychological factors in the bodies of individuals, such as the disproportionate amount of suicides among indigenous peoples in Canada, and ignoring of the social and structural conditions that create these problems, as we've discussed. Many scholars have problematized much educational and developmental research for positioning indigenous peoples as other, and argue that indigenous groups have been implicitly dehumanized, giving colonizers justification to control land and bodies. So today, these legacies are still very visible in research and education, as we've discussed through this course. And Linda Tuhiwai-Smith argues that the flow of dominant knowledge operates through knowledge economies, where certain truths are privileged through larger social and economic structures. So, for example, the bodies that govern and fund research and education, the ways in which we learn in schools, how our bodies are physically regulated by the structure of a classroom, the topics that are taught at the university and in schools and early childhood spaces are all constructed within North America's colonial project, settler colonial project. And these frameworks of developmental research and representation have significant implications on the social distribution of power, and as Spivak has previously said, allow certain noise to be heard.